Hello, this is Margaret Ajibade, the STEM Positive Disruptor. And today again, I have my special guest, Guy Huntington. He's from Vancouver, West Vancouver, Canada. He is what you describe as a veteran identity architect. He describes us as the identity problem solver for humans and AI systems. Yes, last time we spoke, we talked about um, his journey and why he felt this is so important for us to start looking at things in a different way where learning is concerned, because it's about making learning inclusive rather than being exclusive. Because we do know that the system does not work in a way that it should do. And Guy is such an amazing guy, and his aim is to make it more inclusive. And his journey and why he feels this is the way forward. And he's going to talk more about that. Today, he's going to talk about the legal identity aspect of it. So, yeah, and the reason why we set up this platform, we want to educate, we want to raise awareness, we want to change perception. We want to demystify things. And, Guy is just an amazing guy on how he thinks and how he's done so much background work that he basically explains to why he feels it's necessary for us to move forward in this light. And so, again, I do want to encourage you to please support this program, support us by liking, by commenting, by subscribing, but also to share with your network as well what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, welcome, Guy.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
You asked me to introduce myself, tell your audience a little bit about me. So I'm going to. So I'm an old, gray-haired identity architect. I've been in the business for about 3.5 decades. And I entered the identity business just when it was beginning in the 90s. And I worked for a company called Oblix, which was bought by Oracle later. And then I worked for Boeing. I led their efforts with an identity architect called Mike Beach at Boeing. Then I worked at Capital One. I worked at all sorts of large companies running large leading edge identity projects. And then I led the government of Alberta's digital citizen identity and authentication project. I was the identity architect there. And so I've got a lot of experience in identity. I've also done lots in education. I'll just give you a little primer on education. So when I was the vice president academic at the University of Alberta Students' Union several decades ago, I got really interested in learning, and I found out about co-op programs. I tried to get that going at the university unsuccessfully at the time. When my kids were young in the early 90s, I went to introduce myself to the superintendent of our school district. He asked me to chair their new tech committee. That led me to negotiate with the local telco to lay fiber to most of the schools. We're one of the first in Canada to do that. I then was behind building a tech leverage school. I was also the past president of Skills Canada BC and Skills Canada. Okay, so that's me in a nutshell. I'm an old guy. I've done lots of stuff. And I want to talk to you today about legal identity. And I want to talk about Mary Doe, who's the daughter of Jane Doe. I'm going to pick up the story used in the last podcast. But before I do that, I want to describe the problems that Mary and Jane have. So how can Mary prove her legal identity from when she's an infant to when she's old like me easily? And how can she do that locally and globally, digitally and physically? Today, it's not easily possible. Then how can she prove her legal identity relationship to her mom? That's a problem too. How can that work digitally and physically, locally and globally? And then how can she, as she gets older, like my mom has dementia, how can I then prove my power of attorney relationship with my mom, locally and globally, digitally and physically? It's darn complicated. So now I'm going to take you back into the midst of time, about 2004, 2005, when I was sitting here thinking about legal identity. And I was thinking about human cloning. This is like sci-fi stuff in the old days. And I thought, I wonder how we're going to differentiate human clones. So I contacted Sir Alex Jeffreys, a guy who invented the use of DNA for forensics in England. He was knighted for it. We had an email conversation back and forth. And I asked Alex, I said, I'm a dummy. Tell me about cloning and stuff like that. He said, Guy, he said, you can't use DNA to identify clones because they're probably going to be genetically identical. So I said, well, what are we going to do? And he said, you could probably use DNA, use fingerprints and iris scans. So I went in the back of my mind. So I immediately began to research fingerprints and iris scans. And it was early days in those times. People didn't think you could do infant fingerprints, and iris scans were just beginning. So I pushed that aside. And then when I began my journey about 8 years ago, rethinking learning and legal identity, I thought, holy schmoly. So I researched I did two things. I researched fingerprints, and I came across a guy out of Michigan State University, Dr. Anil Jain, and he and his team were pioneering at the time use of infant fingerprints. And they did successfully do it. It's been expanded around the world. Today, that tech is now here. So that's point one. Iris scans, the technology really rapidly advanced. You use it all the time now. So that's here. So I thought, oh, okay, so what Alex told me about is possible. Then I was thinking about human cloning. So I came across this company out of China called Boya Life, Boya Life, and I'll provide the links at the end so that Margaret can put them up. And I found out they were cloning at the time 100,000 cows a year. They're working towards 1 million cows a year, which they do today. And the CEO publicly stated they could clone humans, but they weren't. And I realized that the UN Declaration of Cloning wasn't signed by all countries. And I realized that cloning is now effectively here, human cloning. And so I thought, oh my God, we have to basically design the system, because say you're in a jurisdiction where human cloning is allowed, and then you go to another jurisdiction, how are they going to know it's Mary Doe, not Mary Doe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Okay. That's a problem. So then I was thinking about biometrics. I utterly hate how we use biometrics today, because they're used higgly-piggly all over the world. They're stored in all these different databases, and they're easily breached. Can you give me some examples? I will. Consider the Aadhaar, Aadhaar. It's the National Identity System of India. Age 5 up, you provide your biometrics, you get a national identity. It's been hacked twice. Okay, then in Israel, their biometric database was hacked. The United States biometric databases are hacked. Blah, blah, blah. So I realized that I didn't like how biometrics are used. And what are you going to do if your biometrics are stolen? You're screwed. So I wanted to architect it such that we are in control of our own biometrics. So I thought, how the hell am I going to do that? So I came across the work of a guy called Ruud Bolle, Bolle, out of Holland, about 2015, 2016. And he was talking in a research paper about anonymous biometrics. So they take a biometric, they take an algorithm, and they digitize the biometric, they apply the algorithm to the biometric. And so Mary would give a secret 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that would then be her personal secret, which would then protect her biometric. And so if the biometric is stolen, she would just go re-register it with a different unique identifier. I thought, holy schmoly, there is a possible solution. Now, all this stuff I've just told you, I'm going to use it in the story, but I'm an old identity architect, and I know, frankly, that shit happens. And it's really complicated. So you have people that will try and attack it. You'll have people who will, you'll have people who don't have eyes or fingerprints, or they lose them, and all this kind of stuff. And maybe Ruud Bolle stuff doesn't work. It doesn't scale out properly in the real world, or it does. So in this 503-page cost center document I prepared, I went through all of that. And I have all sorts of cost centers where brighter brains than me can weigh in and say, let's do it this way instead of that. Okay, that is the prelude to the story. So we'll go back to Mary Doe. She's born to Jane Doe, and she gets her legal identity. So how's that going to work? So they're going to take her fingerprint at birth. They'll take her fingerprints, and they'll enter that into a new age CRVS system. What the heck is that? It's called the Civil Registration Vital Stats System. It's your birth registry and death registry systems. Now, the problem is that around the planet, they're not all typically run nationally. They're often run at local, state, provincial levels, which is politics. And I'll come to that in another podcast talking about how I dealt with that, because these states are very territorial, and they'll basically say, fuck you, we don't want you to muck with our stuff, right? That's effectively what they say. So I had to deal with that too. But pushing that aside, let's continue on with the story where Mary Doe is born, and she has her fingerprints obtained, and at a later date, when she can keep her eyes open, she'll have her iris scan taken. That's entered into the database. And then I wanted to get this data out of there into a database that we control. So I was talking to a guy called Scott David at the University of Washington several years ago, and he gave me the idea of creating a database per person on the planet. And I immediately called that in my head a SOLICT, Source of Legal Identity and Credential Truth, SOLICT. And so push aside like who manages that, how you control it through your entire life, blah, 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 which we'll talk about in another podcast. In this story today, Mary Doe has her own SOLIC. But then in the CRVS system, I was thinking, how are we going to cross-pollinate the relationship between Mary Doe and Jane Doe, mother and child? I thought, And so I then came up with the idea in my head of cryptographically cross-linking the databases within the entries within the database, the CRVS system. So then I thought we could probably do the same in the SOLIC, such that there would be a cross-reference between Mary Doe's SOLIC and Jane Doe's SOLIC. That's how we can then basically do it. Now we're in control of our legal identity. We have our legal identity, we have our biometrics, and we're in control of it. And let's assume that Ruth Bowles' ideas works out, and Jane Doe gives on behalf of Mary a secret number or whatever that's applied to the algorithm, such that now Jane and Mary have their own biometrics which they control. Oh. Okay, so then moving right along, we have Mary Doe, and she's now coming up to 3 age. So go back to the podcast I did before, where Mary Doe, Jane takes her by the hand, takes her into a healthcare clinic. So the first problem is how the heck is she going to basically prove her identity? How are they going to prove Mary's identity and Jane's identity? So I thought through this before. So I thought that from the SOLIC, on top of that, we're going to have legal self-sovereign identity devices, LSSI. And you're thinking, what the hell is that? And it's not that complicated. So in your pocket or your purse, you have probably cards, smart cards.
Okay.
It could be a smart card. It could be a digital app.
Mm-hmm.
It also could be like my mom who has dementia. She can no longer use tech. Or it could be Mary, who's really young, who cannot use tech. Or she could be any one of the millions, hundreds of millions of people who live around the planet who are very poor, don't have access to tech. And so I came up with the idea of using biometrically wristbands, physical wristbands, biometrically tied to us, which contain our legal identity information. So that's possible too. And then there's a fourth way, which I wasn't really comfortable with, but it's totally possible, which is where we have implanted into us. So 4 different ways of LSSI devices, okay?
Okay, doctors are there.
There is that. Then the next step is, I thought about Jane and Mary walking down streets. So I wrote about, let's talk about Mary. She's older now, and she's walking down a street. And walking towards her, all sorts of people, and they have, like you're wearing glasses. What if those glasses were smart? And what if they could then predict your behavior? So my son 3 weeks ago, he was wearing the same type of glasses. I saw him tap the glasses. I said, Tristan, I said, are those smart glasses? He said, yes, Dad. And I thought, holy shit, what I wrote about a couple of years ago is now coming true. So as people walk down the street to you, they'll also be wearing smart IoT clothes, Internet of Things devices embedded in them, connected to their glasses. It's possible to do it in contact lenses, but that tech isn't here yet. And so I thought, holy schmoly. Then you have all of these light posts and cars driving by, and I could see in the future how they would become smart, and they'd be able to identify you as you walk towards them. I thought, oh my God, I thought this is what I call a very non-private world, because they can identify you, predict your behavior. I thought, oh my God, so how am I going to deal with that? So I came up with the concept of a PIAM, Personal Identity Access Management System. It's an AI system. It can work with any of your 4 different types of devices. And you can then preset it. So if Mary wants to preset it such as she's going to let nobody identify her, she can do that. That requires, in parallel, new laws and regulations requiring you to get your identity approval before you can use it. So pushing aside that, we'll talk about that in a later session. Let's assume that happens so that Mary Doe now is in control of her identity, and she has her PIAM on top of her LSSI devices. So then I thought about, well, what am I going to do if Jane is controlling Mary's identity? So then we have to have a relationship where Jane Doe's PIAM can actually authorize on behalf of Mary Doe's PIAM. Okie dokie, all of this stuff, which is all very complicated, it sort of sounds airy-fairy. It's not airy-fairy. It has to work locally and globally, digitally and physically.
Indeed.
So when Mary and Jane walk into the clinic, here's what happens. Mary Doe and Jane Doe instantly use their LSSI devices to prove their identities. And so if it's a high-risk situation, they could take their biometrics and check them against their LSSI devices, which checks against their SOLIC. Okay, that's possible. So then that's going to happen instantly. The next thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have Jane Doe is going to give her permission via her PIAM to the health agency to basically do a learning assessment on Mary. So then Mary's gonna, so that all those consents that are given from Mary from when she's born until when she dies are stored in her Solent. So she has one place to go for everything. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, talking about EU and GDPR and Article 17, if you're lucky enough to go there. But pushing that aside, let's go on to Mary and Jane in the health clinic. So Mary gives permission. And then what happens is that there's a physical bot which does a learning assessment on Mary, and it figures out how she learns, how she doesn't learn, how she works with others, how she doesn't work with others, what her aptitudes are, blah, blah, blah. All that data gets put into a new database, which is created for Mary. It's called her Learner Data Vault, which I talked about in the earlier podcast. On top of that sits a digital learning twin. So the health center will automatically write to the CRVS system and it'll create a digital identity for her digital learning twin, which is attached to Mary's legal identity. This is the beginning of creating a security framework for Mary and Jane as they work through their lives. So then you have the digital learning twin, and it comes up with the first individualized education plan for Mary. And that'll be totally different than what IEPs are used today. So then their health clinic's going to send home, hypothetically, in the not so distant future, a physical learning assistant bot, which I call Assist Bot, to Mary. And if you want to sort of Google this, you think, Guy, are you smoking drugs? Like, is this all possible? Google QT robot out of Luxembourg, and it's old school, and I just see all that stuff progressing. So, okay, so they're going to send that home. When they do that, the health clinic's going to automatically register against the CRVS system, AssistBot's legal identity against Mary's identity. This is again a way of creating security frameworks where AssistBot's tied to Mary's legal identity. So then they go home. So then in the story I created before, Mary is autistic and she's very brilliant. So the learning assistant bot and the DLT might say, gee, we should bring in a human learning specialist. So we're going to call in Mary Good Teacher. And she could come in either physically to their home, or she could come in digitally via a VR system. How the heck are they going to know it's Mary Good Teacher and not an imposter? And how are they going to know that Mary Good Teacher has her credentials or not? All of that is now possible through this the identity framework I just created. So I told you about. So what's happened is Jane will be able to instantly verify Mary's legal identity through Mary's Solent and her LSSI devices. They'll also be able to obtain her credentials. We can verify her credentials because every time you gain a credential, it's entered into your Solent, which you control. So that is how it all works. So then they're going to call in and Mary's going to help Jane. So now Mary goes to her first day of school. Da, 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 da. And I'm thinking back to when I went to school holding my mom and dad's hand, really scared, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you weren't, maybe you just walked into school as a brilliant type person. But pushing that aside, it's going to be totally different because they're going to instantly be able to prove their legal identities and their relationships. It's going to happen like snap. And then the parents, Jane Doe, is going to grant on Mary's behalf the school district's permission to access Mary's digital learning twin, her learner data vault, and her IEP. That changes everything because all of a sudden now the school knows Mary intimately in her learning. And that then all the learning management systems, all this infrastructure stuff in the schools has to change because they have to basically take in Mary's identity. She's going to bring her assist bot, her learning assistant bot with her. And I thought, oh my God, all this architecture has to change underneath, which of course almost nobody's thinking about. So then Mary enters school, and she could easily be doing high school and university level courses when she's in elementary. So every time she completes a course, say math 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever you want to call the course in high school, then automatically that is automatically entered into her Solent. So she has all these credentials. Then as Mary advances, and she could use VR and AR, VR glasses to basically take these courses, if it works for her, then she could take university level courses while she's in elementary. Like that's like unheard of. So that is the part of the story. Now, there's another little bit. So I'm going to talk about a story I wrote about Mary Doe's mother, Jane. And she's Dr. Doe. I had her as a medical doctor, and she works in a hospital or medical practice, and she has her own medical assistant bot, a doctor bot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now that is registered against a legal identity against Jane's.
Mm-hmm.
And I had she interacting with all these people in the hospital or her patients. And she's going to be interacting with her MedBot. Her MedBot requires digital credentials too.
Mm-hmm.
Ah. So
Right.
then I will talk about tomorrow. I'm not the next podcast. We won't talk about
Next one.
talk about how all these digital identities for AI systems are created. It's a minefield. So moving right along, let's assume it all works magically. Then Jane is going to interact with all these different entities. So she's going to have all
Okay.
her colleagues. They're going to have their own medical assistant bots. She's going
Mm-hmm.
to deal with the patients. They might have their own medical bots. And it's what I call a darn complex environment. Then there's AI systems that could be doing diagnostics. And that's what I call a hive. So I want to basically put in your head this idea of hives.
Hi. Okay.
So I use the idea of a hive, a beehive, and
Yes.
each hive is all these little cells. And
Yes.
each person is a cell. And around them are all these different relationships with other bees. So the hive is a good concept to use with learning assistants or any kind of workplace environment.
Mm-hmm.
So Jane Doe has these hive relationships, but it's darn complicated because it could have many to many relationships between her and all sorts of different entities. And then you have to think about the data and the privacy. So what data can Jane use and what data can't she use? How can she use it? How can her medbots use it? How can the AI systems use it? It's darn complicated. So that takes us into what we call authorization relationships. Let's just push that aside for another day to talk about. But let's assume that somehow underneath the architecture magically addresses this, and we have a hive relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing applies to Mary when she goes to school. She's going to be in a learning hive.
Mm-hmm.
And all the kids coming into school, they'll have their own learning assistant bots. There'll be teachers. There'll be Mary, good teacher, and she has Bob bot and Patty bot.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what's going to happen. So now I'm near the end of the story. So the thing is that Mary has hives. She works in a hive relationship. She leaves school. She works in learning hive relationships, working relationships, hive relationships, all throughout her life.
Mm-hmm.
And all this architecture is there to allow her to be in control of her legal identity and to basically, if somebody steals it or somebody breaches it, she can basically instantly have it redone. And that is a magical way of viewing the future. End of my spiel.
Well, thank you. You know, it's fascinating, and it's in a way what it does do is it's challenge one's thinking, and that's very good. It also brings it raises lots of questions, such as, you know, this is an ideal scenario where Mary and Jane Doe is concerned. You know, you talked slightly a bit about if you were in a different environment, so you don't have all the facilities, and you talk about the security aspect of it as well. These are things that, you know, people think, but also it's quite complex. It's like there's so many layers, and I know you talked about the AI. Think about a hive or a beehive or whatever, but you know the complexity of it. But you know, we should not discard it or disregard it, because if you think about it, he talks about, you know, smart glasses, things are moving very quickly, moving very fast. So what we're talking about now may look as if it's a long time future, but it's actually, there's lots of things that are already taking place that we need to be aware of, and it's about using. We need to counterbalance that as well. Is what do we need to put in place to ensure we preserve the identity of, talk about Jane Doe, Mary Doe, and much more beside that as well. Talk about the legal identity. So it's so this. There are so many. It's seriously. I really fascinated, and just listening to you today, I can see things in a much more clearer way, but also raises a lot of questions. So if we, in this ideal world, if, as you said, let's talk about the last bits you spoke about. If, for example, is it Mary that lost her identity, she can quickly recover that. But you also talked about the different ways to have that twin digital, the digital learning twin, and that it's the security aspect. Lots of things that I know you've already covered. Some people want to talk more about anyway, but also it's about. I guess in so many ways it's about, unless you try something, you never know whether or not it's going to work or not. It's the translation from the vision to an application of that vision and see whether or not it in reality that it can work. And I guess that's really the question. And that's really something that I'm sure you already thought about how it's going to take place. And so I don't know, because what I want you to do is actually convey to the audience, is this not just a thing in the cloud? Is it real? I know I'm just using, but it's again, people are going to listen to you, and I want them to get a feel like can we possibly, we know there are other things happening. Talks about your son with the smart glasses, and we know that people there, even in sports now, we have smart clothing that we can use to help us. There's so many things that are going on, so there's no us saying it's in 20 years is a lie. We're really looking at maybe in the next 5 years things will change completely, or maybe something's already happening, but we don't really know about it yet.
So let me interject. So I'm an old guy and I've led lots of very complicated projects
Yeah,
and that work across multiple systems and multiple environments, physically and digitally.
yeah,
And so I've learned from that. And so when
okay.
I set out with this vision, I was thinking, and I know more than most people, not all people. I know a lot of the challenges, security, the privacy, and the complexity of all this stuff. And I
Mm,
was, and also, as I say, shit happens. So there's all sorts of variations that you have to address. So I then created a 503-page cost center doc, and I worked through all of this stuff. And I worked through incrementally, and I broke it down in little chunks. And I said, like, is Rude Bull's idea is going to work or not? If it doesn't
mm,
work, you have to go to another alternative.
mm,
And what happens if they don't have fingerprints or eyes? Blah blah blah. And then I worked through how it's going to work locally and globally, which is mostly politics, not so much technically. But I'll talk about that in another day, another
okay.
podcast. We'll talk about that. But I have worked my way through it as best I can. So I've laid out at the 100,000-foot level on architecture. And I said in the last podcast, I said, I love it on teams I lead where they effectively say, Guy, YFOS, you're full of shit. Why didn't you know about Y when you wrote about X? Duh.
Okay.
And I love that because I'm not the smartest knife in the drawer or sharpest knife in the drawer. And so I think that at the 100,000-foot level, I've laid out the architecture, and brighter brains than me will form in lots of different teams. And I've costed it all out as guesstimates. And I'll talk about that in another podcast about the price of doing this.
Okay.
And I've done the best I can to sort of lay the initial groundwork where people can then take it and say, Guy, YFOS, here's a better way of doing it.
Mm.
But that is me. I've laid out as best I can the architecture from a high-level story, written stories about it like Mary and Jane, and down to the actual guts of the architecture and security and keeping it up to date. So in another architecture, we're going to talk about this technology shaped curve, which is logarithmic, which is the rapid rate of change. We talk about the evil links attacking it. And I think, oh my God, I have to basically architect for that.
Do you know, I did. There's so much. I've read really some of the things you've done, and I know you're a very, very detailed person. You do lots of iteration. You look for a problem, and you look for, and then you provide a solution. But also, it's being aware. But in a way, that's why I like. I'm enjoying this conversation with you because you're a visionary who sees things you're not fixed in that box, and it's about opening that outlet to others to see things in a different way. But also, what you're doing, even though we may think it's out of the box, it's not really. Reality is saying that AI is being developed, evolving so quickly and so fast that if we don't get on the bandwagon, we're going to lose sight and we're going to miss out on this opportunity. And you're saying, look, let's have a conversation. And I want people to come and talk to you and have a conversation with you because what you're saying is reality. It may not be in the black and white as it's put down in place as yet, but things are happening so quickly and so fast as well that we have to start thinking in a different way, not just for us in our own little corner, beyond ourselves, because the world is so inclusive because of technology, in the sense that you are able to engage in so many different ways using technology. But you know, there are so many questions.
Let
But
me interrupt you. Time out for a second. So what I want to do, you
but
asked,
we're not going to be talking more about it. What I do want is for the audiences to really take time to listen to what you're saying. I want them to grasp why you're saying this is an important reason for us to look at things in a slightly different way to how we've looked at things for so far. So thank you, Guy. I can't wait for the next episode
I just
of
want to end
our
with,
conversation.
I want to end with where they can find all my work. The best place to go is to my LinkedIn webpage.
Okay.
And on the LinkedIn webpage, choose any of the articles I've written. There's about 150 different articles referenced all below it. So
Okay.
read that, and then you can contact me at GUI at hvl.net.
Thank you so much. Again, as guys mentioned, you can contact him via LinkedIn, and it's giving the details as well. Do you know, I do, when you do come across this podcast, I do really want you to listen to this. I do want you to not switch off, but just take time to review, to hear what Guy is saying, because what he's saying is not in a distant future. What he's saying is that we have to take stock now. We have to review where we are. And these are the steps that we can take to enable us to protect our identity, to do much more than that. But again, look, there's a couple more episodes of this. So and if you need more information, please contact Guy as well. Again, I do want you to please support us, subscribe, comment, make some comments. We need some more comments. If you have questions, Guy's going to be at the end of the line to answer those questions anyway. But also, if you feel this is an interesting topic, then like it, so we can then share more similar things like these that we're going to have in the future as well. So again, thank you so much, Guy, for an interesting, very
Audience.
thought-provoking conversation. I can't wait for the next episode. And we will talk more about what that's going to be, and we'll take it from there as well. So again, thank you so much.
Ciao.
Thank you.